One of the most important and indeed most controversial issues in all of American history is the relationship between the Constitution and the American Revolution. For most of the modern period, starting with the Progressive era at the turn of the 20th century, American scholars have been divided over that issue. The Progressives, people like Charles Beard, Vernon Parrington, argue that the Constitution was a counter-revolutionary movement, that the revolution was a kind of democratic, egalitarian movement, and the Constitution was an effort by elites to stem the tide of that revolutionary movement and basically rein in the radicalism of the American Revolution. So the question is, which of those interpretations makes better sense of the evidence? And of course, as you would expect, there's a certain amount of truth in each of those interpretations. The first thing to recognize is there's not one American Revolution. There are multiple experiences in the Revolution. So if we take Pennsylvania as our model, Pennsylvania is a very egalitarian and democratic revolution, but it's an interesting one because they also disenfranchise a huge percentage of their population. Loyalists, Quakers, people who did not side with the revolution. So they're very democratic, but they're also very exclusionary. We tend to think that democracy should be inclusionary, so even if we use Pennsylvania as a model of the most radical experience of the revolution, it's not a kind of democracy that I think many of us are completely comfortable with. There's also the question of slavery, which of course is a big one, and of course there's not one single response that the revolution has with regard to slavery. The revolution put slavery in New England that after the American Revolution, slavery in New England is essentially over. The Middle Atlantic, particularly New York and Pennsylvania, turned to gradual abolition schemes, which will eventually put slavery on the road to extinction. And of course, in the South, slavery remains a vital institution, but at least in the Chesapeake region, it is easier to manumit your slaves, which is to say to free them. And of course, some prominent Virginians, including George Washington, do free their slaves. Thomas Jefferson, of course, only frees the Hemings family, which we could talk about because it's a fascinating subject, but a subject for another day, perhaps. Now, so we have, with these new state constitutions, a predictable human situation, which is having experienced a strong government, most of the states enact much weaker kinds of government. So for instance, the executive, the new governors of these state governments, much weaker than the strong monarchical form of government that England has. The Articles of Confederation, the first effort to have a national constitution, doesn't even have a proper executive. It has a committee, and the head of that committee is called the president, which is where we get the name for our head of state, our executive. So, and the Articles of Confederation decides that because the powerful Parliament had enacted all these onerous taxes, they will not give this new government the power to tax. And of course, trying to imagine how you're going to fight a war and how you're going to have a government without the power to tax is an interesting question. So, in terms of understanding the revolutionary experience, there really isn't one revolutionary experience. There are multiple strains coming out of the revolution, and not all of the experiments that the revolution inaugurates are entirely successful. So to understand the Constitution, we need to understand how it is a reaction not so much against British tyranny, although that is still on people's minds. It is primarily a reaction to the Articles of Confederation and indeed to some of the problems that are occurring under the state governments. So what are those problems?